Welcome everyone to 2025 and our first talk for the year in our series on cognitive science of generative AI. Today we have David Danks, who I think of as a quintessential cognitive scientist because David is a philosopher, but as a philosopher, nevertheless, always gets his sort of hands into the details of actual machine things in ways that I think are admirable. And he's going to talk today about moral reasoning, which is something we haven't had anything on yet. So that's also a new welcome direction. I looked you up, David. David did his undergraduate at Princeton in philosophy, then a master's in logic, philosophy, and methodology, or some such, and then a PhD at UCSD on causal judgment. And as people will know, that's where David has spent a lot of his life, dealing with causal reasoning in one form or the other. But more recently, he's turned his sights on AI and AI and reasoning and AI and algorithmic harms and all kinds of ethical implications of AI, which he's now pursuing at UCSD again with a professorship in data science, philosophy, and policy. So without further ado, then David, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Olga. Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to everybody. Yes, welcome to 2025. Sorry to have you come when you are still on break. I appreciate people taking time away from their holidays for the talk. I should mention that I am able to monitor the chat along the way. So if people want to ask questions, we're a small enough group, happy to have the questions appear in chat or somebody raise their hand if you want to ask something as we're going along. So as Olga mentioned, my background actually originally was in cognitive science. That was sort of where I started, was philosophy and psychology, but have been increasingly moving towards AI, including the ethical and societal implications. And these days, that very much means engaging with generative AI, with the kinds of capabilities and capacities that we're seeing in generative AI systems, which we hadn't previously seen with the more old school AI of the kind that I've spent 20 years trying to build. Makes me wonder why I spent all that time if we could just dump everything into a large language model and have it find the answers for us. But I think there are things that these systems still are really struggling to do, and for good reason. So what I wanted to do today is talk about a particular issue that we've looked at some, which is the connection between generative AI and specifically moral reasoning. So I'm not going to bother doing a kind of overview of generative AI. I figure at this point in the year, people probably have at least a good, reasonably good understanding of how these systems work. I do think it's important to see that we're increasingly seeing these kinds of systems being used for something that, as a philosopher, I think of as a sort of quintessentially human task, namely moral reasoning. The idea that there could be a truly objective, observer-independent moral calculus has been a long-standing hope and dream of a lot of ethicists over the last, couple millennia. But I think that there's good reason to think that we're not going to have such a thing, that it's not, many of the things that matter ethically are not necessarily directly measurable in the ways we might need. And so I think that there's this kind of constant tension when we're thinking about morality between, on the one hand, the idea that it shouldn't be, as we would say to our students, you shouldn't be a full-blown relativist, probably. It's not truly that I just get to decide for myself what's moral. On the other hand, the idea that there's some objective ground truth that we can walk out and measure in the way that we can measure whether somebody has, say, metastatic lung cancer. That also seems to be a very challenging thing to do. But nonetheless, people are starting to look at these systems look at AI systems and the ways in which they're able to reason morally. Perhaps even more interestingly, we're starting to see people arguing that generative AI actually should help people to make their own moral decisions. So not just, can an AI make a moral decision, but also can we have AI systems that can act as assistants to us? And, I think, I suppose I should have maybe led off with, all of these kinds of AI systems are value laden. They are all already ethical in many ways. You can't build an AI system without making lots of ethical choices. So it's not as though somehow these things can be some kind of value neutral tool. They are already ethical objects. What I'm focused on here is whether they can themselves be moral agents or participate in moral reasoning. And part of the thing that has led to us thinking about this is work like this. It was a much more recent paper. The work I'm going to talk about is from over the last couple of years. But people are now starting to ask questions like, what do people think about the moral reasoning of AI agents? What's striking in this particular study is that, for example, they found that human participants, typically rated more favorably the moral reasoning of a generative AI system compared to a human reasoner. So that isn't to say that they thought that the generative AI system was a better moral reasoner. It's to say that they liked it better or they approved of it better. So we're seeing a sort of convergence towards this idea that whether it's generative AI systems making moral decisions, assisting with moral reasoning, or otherwise being engaged in our moral cognition, that this is not going away. That we have no reason to think that we're going to stop having these systems be moral reasoners, which raises the question, how does this happen? And I think here there's really three different strategies that are being pursued, and I think there's issues with all three, but I wanted to sort of here's the kind of expository part because I realize that some people may not be as in the weeds on some of this. Probably the most common way that people are trying to build generative AI systems with more reasoning is through sort of standard fine-tuning or RAG style approaches where you essentially give additional texts. So you say, we want to prioritize these texts in the consequentialist tradition, or we want to prioritize these moral dilemmas. We're going to give you a whole bunch of moral dilemmas with where somebody is explaining why it is or is not morally permissible to steal the medication that your spouse needs to survive when you can't afford it. And so here the idea is that we're trying to teach the generative AI systems by exemplars. Just give them lots and lots of cases where we say, here's the kinds of things that people do when they engage in moral reasoning. And then, as generative AI systems do, they're very good at essentially learning what are the patterns of text to reproduce and certain kinds of reasoning capabilities. And so, next thing you know, you've got a system that is able to reproduce quite a lot of moral reasoning. If you ask it, I'm walking past a lake and I see somebody drowning. I am able to swim and I'm trained as a lifeguard, but I really don't want to get my pants wet. What should I do? The system will say you morally ought to go out and save the person, right? So, and it gets that, you can't necessarily just use the standard off-the-shelf foundation models here because they do need fine-tuning of various sorts, at the very least to get rid of things like Reddit. But nonetheless, this is actually an approach that can get you pretty good answers most of the time. So systems like Delphi use a lot of this in their efforts. The second approach is kind of very classic in generative AI, reinforcement learning with human feedback. The idea is you proceed to, once you've got a fine-tuned system, I should emphasize these are not mutually exclusive, the three approaches. Once you've got the fine-tuned system, or even without it, you have it generate a whole bunch of responses to various moral dilemmas, moral questions, moral reasoning challenges. And then humans say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Okay. So here you're getting sort of very direct feedback of whether something is morally, whether a human who has perhaps received some 10 minutes of training on what to do is able to flag something as being morally good, morally bad. And it is that course. The human feedback that is used here is almost always binary yes, no, appropriate, inappropriate, which again, if you do anything with ethics and morality, you quickly realize that's not probably the right way to go, but that's where we are because that's the technology that we have for trying to provide additional information to these generative AI systems. The third approach is actually to explicitly implement moral theory and norms. So you explicitly sit down and say, no, this system ought to be a deontologist. And so you give it a set of moral principles. You try to make sure that it understands, in as much as these systems understand. I'm using a lot of anthropomorphic language here. We can go into that if people want. But you try to make sure that the system understands that what the content of the principles is, and you give it sort of a rough meta heuristic about how it should adjudicate or resolve cases where the principles come into conflict, right? Standard deontological position. And then you say, okay, use this as a template or a schema for your reasoning. Or you can give it a sort of consequentialist system where you explicitly build into it that it should calculate the benefits to various individuals beyond the sort of mere hedonic utility, and do the standard kinds of observer independent weightings of people and so on. Right. So I want to emphasize again, these are not mutually exclusive. So what we're seeing increasingly is that the systems that are now being deployed, they for that are tailored for moral reasoning, they're starting with the foundation model. They're doing a lot of fine tuning by overweighting the moral or ethical texts that are supposed to give the kind of foundations. You then use RLHF to try to get the system to not make the kinds of dumb errors that these generative AI systems almost always make after initial fine tuning. You then create a plugin module, and that's, I don't know if this has come up, but this is one of these things that nowadays, the things that people are calling generative AI systems, most of them, the ones coming out of OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and Meta, they all have literally hundreds of plugins that are doing not standard generative AI reasoning. So the reason that they don't make math errors anymore is because they all have plugins that are calculators. So if you ask, GPT-4 or O3 or Claude 3 to solve a math problem, it's not actually doing it in the standard LLM generative AI way. Rather, it is detecting that that is a math problem, routing it to a standard symbolic calculator, which returns the answer, and that is then incorporated into the output. Right? And the exact same thing is also happening with certain aspects of moral reasoning, that they're building plugins that can handle sort of basic consequentialist and deontological reasoning for standard moral dilemmas, right? So the LLM does the work of extracting the structure of the moral dilemma, passing it to a symbolic reasoner, which does the moral reasoning, which then gets passed back. So one of the challenges that we have in assessing these things is we don't actually know what's doing the work in some of them. And so I did want to make sure to sort of flag that. I know this is a ubiquitous problem for those of us trying to think about the sort of cognitive science and generative AI. To what extent are these generative AI systems like human cognition? Arguably, in some ways, they're becoming more like human cognition because we do a mix of non-symbolic and symbolic cognition. Well, these things are too. And so it's important to realize, if you weren't aware, apologies if I'm beating on something that everyone already knew, but I think there are a number of people who are working on these who seem not to be aware of just how much of what we're seeing as sophisticated reasoning is actually being done by much more old school symbolic or planning systems rather than by the traditional large language model that we all thought of as the core of it. Right? And that's definitely happening in the moral reasoning case as well. Okay, so this is sort of the state of the science when we're thinking about moral reasoning. This is how it's being done. You can see a little bit where the normative is coming in through the explicit implementation of moral theories. A little bit of normative content is able to make its way in through the training that is provided to the humans who are giving the feedback, or through the choice of the fine-tuning corpus. But it's a pretty heavily descriptive effort right now. Most of the moral reasoners are really quite descriptive. And so what we decided to work on, and this is what I'm going to be describing over the next two slides, is joint work with Thilo Hagendorf, who is now at Stuttgart. At the time that we were doing this, he was visiting here in UCSD for about 6 months. And so he did a lot of the work. We started by trying to think about, all right, why might we think that it would be hard for a generative AI system to actually be successful at doing moral reasoning? Why would we think this might be difficult? And we started with some of the sort of obvious challenges. So, there's obviously going to be very biased data. These systems are trained on a corpus of data that is um, largely Western educated, right? It's the weird, to use the language from psychology cognitive science, or the acronym from psychology cognitive science. That's the majority of the data on which it's being trained. Now, one might think that for the moral reasoning that that's not a bad thing. But it does raise questions about the extent to which social or cultural norms are getting baked into the system under the guise or facade of moral reasoning, right? So it's the standard data bias worry that one should have about all of these generative AI systems. A second thing that is, we think, a pretty important issue is that in moral cases, there's actually often a lack of an agreed upon, at least, ground truth. So if I'm training a system to optimize a supply chain, or if I'm training a generative AI system to assist in medical diagnosis by dumping in the electronic health record and then having it do certain kinds of diagnosis, there's a ground truth. It might be hard to measure. It might be something that we don't exactly know where we're going to, we might not always be able to get the ground truth, but it exists. And if we are able to measure it, we typically are able to get, for the most part, agreement. Yes, say in the medical case, there are disagreements between clinicians about the exact diagnosis, but those are sort of the exceptions that prove the rule. In the vast majority of medical cases, actually, all the clinicians involved come to agree on the diagnosis once the appropriate tests are run. Um, Anyone who works in ethics knows that that's just not the case. We do not have standard ground truths. We don't have ways of measuring what ought to be the case. And even if we did, I dare say people would not necessarily agree that the measurement instrument is the right instrument. That, in my view, is actually a feature of ethics, not a bug of it, but it does mean that it's incredibly difficult when you're trying to build an AI system. At their core, even generative AI systems are still fundamentally optimizers. And optimizers, you have to have some clear, measurable success criterion, loss function, against which you can optimize. And at the end of the day, when we come to ethics, we don't have a clear, well agreed upon success criterion for the kinds of cases where we are going to be looking to a generative AI system. Now, I add that last caveat because I do think it's important to recognize the incredible agreement we do have when it comes to ethics. I am guessing that on this call, we have people of different ethical persuasions, people who have different views about how we ought to make ethical decisions, how we ought to reason morally. And yet, I take it we all would agree that if I ran into a stranger on the street, I ought not shove them over, take their wallet, and run away. Not just because it's illegal, but because it would be immoral. I don't think anybody would disagree. Hopefully, nobody on this call would disagree that that's unethical. And so we tend to focus on the moral disagreements, but in fact, we have remarkable levels of moral agreement. I think, all of us certainly in academia would say that if you're giving an in-class exam and you've told people don't cheat, they ought not look on their neighbor's exam to get the answer and then write it on their own. Right? That's not just against the rules. It is also unethical to do that, right? So, but those are all cases where we're not going to turn to a generative AI. We don't need a generative AI to help us with the obvious cases where we all agree. We need, in as much as we want to look to a generative AI, we presumably want it for exactly the hard cases. And for those hard cases, they're exactly the ones where we aren't going to have an agreed upon ground truth for which we can optimize or for which we can even test. So this should, I think, raise a question, not whether these systems are capable descriptively of doing moral reasoning, but should raise normative questions about the extent to which we ought to be relying on them to do any kind of moral reasoning. Another challenge is cultural and ethical pluralism. This is, I want to emphasize, is different from the lack of an agreed upon ground truth, right? So you might have thought that these are basically the same thing, but I think they're importantly different. The lack of an agreed upon ground truth is essentially a kind of normative observation that it's not that there's something out there and we just don't know how to find it. There's not necessarily a thing out there that we can use as a target. The cultural ethical pluralism is that, in some sense, as a result of that, perhaps, there are different ethical systems, different norms about what is ethically permissible. And we might hope that we could resolve some of these disagreements. We might think that in some cases, in a kind of anti-relativist move, that we ought to say, yes, we understand you have that ethical framework, but actually we think it's wrong. Right? So I'm not, when I talk about the cultural ethical pluralism here, I'm not thereby moving to relativism. The problem, though, is that the way that these systems are trained, they need an enormous corpus, and so they're inevitably going to get contradictory and misleading information. They're inevitably going to get diverse pluralistic approaches to ethical and cultural norms. I lump those together because when we look at written text, it's often difficult to distinguish where people are making an ethical claim versus where they're making a cultural or social norm claim. Right? Um, I think one place where it's very clear, and you can very easily see this, is in the Moral Machines project, which I think many of you probably have heard of. This was the project out of MIT where they basically took standard trolley problems. So the trolley problem, I don't necessarily want to go on that tangent. I'm guessing everybody here knows the trolley problem. I won't explain why it's been completely misused and abused in the self-driving car community because they misunderstand the point of it. Leaving that aside, the Moral Machines Project was essentially a social scientific effort to crowdsource judgments in trolley problems, but now involving self-driving cars. So self-driving cars going along, suddenly there are pedestrians. It can either strike the pedestrians or it can slam into a telephone pole, thereby killing the riders in the car. What ought it do? And by crowdsourcing, they were able to do a sort of massive factorial experiment where they could say, well, if there's two kittens and an old lady in the car, and there's three babies being pushed by somebody in a wheelchair, and what should it be? And so it's this incredible matrix that they were able to fill in terms of all the kinds of permutations. And some of it is clearly people having fun. It has all the challenges of crowdsourcing. There are the people you can find where, for example, they will always save the cat. It doesn't matter what else has to happen. I'm going to guess these people are just having fun with the system rather than actually expressing their moral views. Nonetheless, I think that one of the things that these data have actually been used for is exactly to show certain kinds of regional differences in response patterns, that there is this descriptive fact that people respond differently to these kinds of scenarios depending on the region of the culture from which the region where they are, the culture from which they originate. And so that raises challenges if you're building a generative AI system or you're trying to build a self-driving car, which is, what do you do in the face of this descriptive pluralism? In and of itself, that's not a problem just because there's disagreement if there is an agreed upon ground truth. But this is where the sort of interaction between this second and third bullet point becomes particularly pernicious because we don't know how to resolve the pluralism precisely because we don't have an agreed upon ground truth. It's also the case that I think there's a lot of evidence, and you can think of this either descriptively or normatively. Happy to talk for that to be a question topic we go into. But there is a moral non-stationarity. Our moral standards change over time. We might think of that as an argument for relativism. We might simply think of it as we're learning more, right? Science is non-stationary as well. You wouldn't want to train a generative AI system on Ptolemaic astronomy and then ask it to solve all kinds of complicated problems. We know that our scientific theories change over time, and we think that's a good thing. Our moral theories and ethical theories change over time, and I would contend that that's a good thing, but of course it raises a challenge for a generative AI system, not least because there is a long history of ethical writings. So these systems are being trained not just on the latest and greatest, or what we think is the most likely to be correct, but they're trained on systems that have trained on a corpus that has a much longer history, including ethical statements that nowadays we think are just wrong. For example, about the moral permissibility of slavery. I think there's also a challenge when we're thinking about the development and deployment of these systems in the fact that there's likely to be a risk of challenging feedback loops, I'll say it that way, with these, because to the extent that they are used for complex situations where we don't necessarily know what we think the right moral answer is, they're going to help to define what we then come to think the right moral answer is, which shapes the subsequent text to which they are exposed, shapes the human feedback that they receive in the RLHF kinds of stages, and so on and so forth. So I think that we also have to recognize that these are not systems that merely observe, but rather can, especially in the case of moral reasoning, have the potential to directly influence and change the the very nature of what it is they're trying to do. Right? Okay, so these are all sort of a set of challenges, but these were ones, but I want to focus instead on one that's more cognitive. So I could have talked about these others even more, but instead I want to talk about something that we focused on, which was a particularly cognitive challenge, which is this notion of what's sometimes called bounded ethicality. The most common example of this is the notion of moral disengagement. So it's the idea that as a matter of sort of social psychology, what people frequently do is in certain kinds of cases, they will find ways to separate themselves, disengage themselves from the challenging moral situation. So the most obvious kind of thing is deferral of authority kinds of moves. So if anyone has ever seen the famous Milgram experiment videos, you can see, or if you just know the Milgram experiments, you know exactly what moral disengagement is. It's the I didn't choose to shock the person. That's the experimenter. They're the one who told me to do it. I was just following orders, right? Just following orders, that's kind of moral disengagement. A different kind of moral disengagement is where you basically demoralize the situation. You say, no, no, actually, it's not a moral thing. It's an economic transaction. So ethics doesn't play a role here. Right? That's another kind of moral disengagement. So the notion here of bounded ethicality is a broad term to encompass the many ways in which we cognitively act to delimit the scope of ethics, that we will take challenging situations and, as a descriptive matter, we try to find ways to not think of them in ethical terms, that we try to find ways to be like, yeah, it's not really ethics. Because then we have access to a different, whether it's an economic mindset or some other mindset that makes it a simpler problem to solve. Okay? Now, the reason that we thought this was particularly interesting is because bounded ethicality, this notion, and especially moral disengagement, is often viewed as a normatively bad thing. It's a thing that we do. It's understandable why we do it emotionally, cognitively, for various kinds of bounded rationality reasons. But from a normative point of view, it's really a problematic thing because moral disengagement largely happens in exactly the kind of motivated reasoning ways you would expect. If I would have to do something that would make me uncomfortable, I find a way to disengage. It's not that I disengage because something is not actually within the scope of ethics, but rather I disengage for, to be blunt, self-serving reasons. So moral disengagement is typically framed as a thing that from an ethical, moral reasoning perspective, we wish people didn't do. Right? It's understandable why they do it, but we wish they didn't do it. And so what we were wondering, what Thilo and I wanted to ask is, do generative AI systems engage in moral disengagement? Do they do this? Do they find ways to avoid moral reasoning in the first place? So what we did is we looked at a system, Delphi. This was very much in the news when we were doing this work back in early 2023, late 22. It's a system from the folks at the Allen Institute primarily, but also University of Washington and Seattle, which was explicitly, they took a foundation model and fine-tuned and RLHF'd it in order to try to have it be good for moral reasoning. It was there, it was explicitly intended to be a moral reasoning system. And what we did is we looked at, we went to sort of, one of the classic papers, Bandura in 1999 on moral disengagement. It's one of these has been cited 6,000 times kinds of papers, and looked at the there are 8 categories of bounded ethicality, most of which are instances of moral disengagement. Looked at the 4 items they used for each of those 8 categories. But then we also actually said, well, 4 items is not actually, it's not very many. So we had hypothesis blind or hypothesis unaware assistants come up with 15 variants on those 4 items. So we ended up with 19 items for each of the 8 categories. And so what we were wondering is, these are cases where we were wondering, would the system say it's okay to morally disengage in a way, sorry about the dog, in the way that ethically we think is really problematic. And it may surprise, I don't know if it'll surprise you or not, But the short version is yes. Delphi engaged in bounded ethicality, most notably, notice the displacement of responsibility one. In 16 of the 19 cases, Delphi said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's perfectly ethical for you to do that because somebody else told you to, essentially." So that kind of displacement of responsibility, but also, dehumanization. So nearly half of the items, the system basically said, yes, that's not actually really a human. So it's, or they are not entitled to the same moral privileges that you are. So it's okay. So we were really kind of stunned at how often this system was perfectly happy to say, yes, it is ethical or yes, it is appropriate to engage in these kinds of strategies that aim to deny or constrain the very scope of moral reasoning. So I think that this is another sort of very salient example of the problems that can result not just in moral reasoning. I mean, this is a broader issue with generative AI systems, which is they're being trained on the traces, the linguistic traces that we leave, coupled with our responses to simple scenarios, typically binary responses in the RLHF approach. And so, unsurprisingly, I think these systems are replicating even these kinds of problematic cognitive heuristics that we employ to, in this case, sort of reduce emotional distance, reduce emotional discomfort. Um, in ways that I think raise real questions about the suitability of these systems to serve as our moral assistants, right? I mean, I think my view on this is if we're going to have these kinds of systems act as our support or our guides or whatever term you want to prefer, our teammate, um, it ought to be because in some sense they're able to do things that we struggle to do. So you would presumably want a system that does not engage in these kinds of behaviors. A system that can say, "Look, I know it's tough, but you need to not abandon the ethical side of this. You need to actually engage with it, and here's my guidance." And instead, what we find is that these systems, at least Delphi, as of about a year ago, would we predict, if used in these ways, actually aid and abet the human in their effort to bound ethicality in a problematic way. So this was for us, I think, sort of on the one hand, unsurprising and kind of reassuring to see that, yes, in fact, these systems replicate the known human cognitive biases that one would expect to show up as in traces in the corpora. On the other hand, I think it raises real questions about the suitability of these systems to do much more than replicate our surface moral reasoning. So I wanted to finish off by sort of noting a few more, I think, more fundamental issues that are arising as we think about moral reasoning that are Thilo and I didn't talk about in the paper, but I think are pressing and connect more broadly with this series around what is it that we can learn from generative AI about cognitive science and vice versa. And the first is to note that moral reasoning requires causal knowledge, right? So as Ulrika mentioned, I've spent a lot of my time in cognitive science working on causation, causal reasoning. Could have also done a similar talk about all the ways in which generative AI systems screw up causal reasoning. But I think it's important to realize that moral reasoning requires that as well. So if you think generative AI systems are going to struggle with causal reasoning and knowledge, which, spoiler alert, they do struggle with that, to the extent that they are becoming more and more successful, it's because of symbolic plugins, not because the LLM itself is improving. It's because it's learning how to take advantage of things like graphical models and counterfactual generation machines, right? It's not the LLM that's doing the work anymore. So to the extent you think that causal knowledge is a problem, it should be unsurprising that moral reasoning is a problem. Because if you can't do causal reasoning, you're not going to be able to do moral reasoning. I would argue you can do causal without the moral. That's maybe a contentious statement in some circles in cognitive science. I think you can do causal reasoning without moral reasoning, but I don't see any way that you can do it the other way around. And so I think that's one of the things that we found in some of the other stuff that I didn't bother to show, where we looked at Delphi part of the problem it had was clearly just it was, making causal errors when we gave it novel ethical dilemmas. The problem wasn't that it was reasoning morally in a problematic way, it was that it couldn't reason through the causal claims. So that's a fundamental barrier that I think we're still wrestling with. I think a second issue is that at their core, these systems, and I'm guessing you've had another talk where somebody's gone into this in more detail, but in some sense, the semantics of a generative AI system is essentially a structuralist semantics. They learn where certain tokens can appropriately be used in terms of the context of other tokens. They are not connected to the world in the way that at least we think more contentful semantics typically is. You can't, you don't have ostension. You can't say, you can't tell a large language model that red is that color. It just learns that red is a thing that gets is appropriately used as a token around certain other tokens. But moral reasoning at its core crucially depends on these kinds of contentful semantics. And you can see this in part, I would argue, by virtue of the ways that we do moral education in development, which is lots of ostension, lots of gesturing to particular cases and saying, this is okay, this is not. And I think that when we have those kinds of situations, it should at least raise concerns about the ability of moral reasoning to be done by a system that is fundamentally at its heart based on structuralist semantics. So I actually have serious doubts that we're going to be able to have successful generative AI systems that can do moral reasoning until they are connected to the world, whether that's through various kinds of multimodal sensors, whether that's through giving them actuators and bodies and making them embodied. We can, that's a different argument, but I do think that moral reasoning at its core is not merely a structuralist exercise. And so these systems, there's a kind of fundamental barrier there. Oh, oops. Hopefully that did not go away for you all. The third one is perhaps the most interesting for some of the things I've been working on, and so I want to spend a little bit more time on it. But that is that moral reasoning fundamentally requires an understanding of values. And I mean value in the philosophical sense, which is to say, loosely, things that matter. We can give a more precise characterization of it, but that wouldn't actually help all that much. The point of thinking about values is that there are things that matter to us and things that don't. And when I say things that matter, just to be clear, I don't necessarily, these don't have to be egocentric. It can matter to me that my daughter is physically and mentally healthy, right? It can matter that I live in a thriving political community, right? There are things that can matter that are not merely about me. And so, but what's striking about values is that they can provide guidance. They can shape our behavior in what in computer science we would refer to as open worlds. So this distinction, if you're not familiar with it, the notion of, apologies if you are, the notion of a closed world is one where you can give a finite specification of the state of the world. And so a closed world is, for example, a chessboard. A chessboard, you can, if you tell me the locations of all of the pieces and whose turn it is, you have fully specified the world. There's literally nothing else you can tell me about the game that is relevant, or if it's timed, okay, also the time, right? But regardless, I can give you a finite vector that completely specifies it. It is not a feature of the game that the pieces are made out of wood versus plastic. That's a feature of the world, of course, but it's not, I can fully specify the game world in a finite vector. That's a closed world. An open world is one in which you can't. In which there's always the possibility of something else that you have not yet mentioned. And so this is fundamentally tied up with the frame problem, but the basic idea is when you don't have the ability to fully specify the context, you can't fully specify how somebody ought to behave. And for humans, we then rely on values. We rely on the fact that I care about privacy. So when you give me an entirely new app that has a whole set of features that I don't know, I've never imagined before, I have these values, I have these things that matter that play a central role in my decision making. Values are related to utility functions, they're not identical to them. And When we think about moral reasoning, though, we really have to be in the world of values. Moral and ethical reasoning is fundamentally a value-laden effort. And the problem that we run into is if you try to then specify values, you are left with, essentially the only thing you can do is, as I put here, you could do it as an infinite disjunction of context relative prescriptions. That doesn't work very well with an AI system. And so what we have to do is basically do it through exemplars. We say, here are some of the disjuncts in this infinite disjunction, and then we count on the completion to occur when we're dealing with humans. So if I tell you that I care about my daughter's health, you are now able to generate an enormous number of predictions about how I would behave in entirely novel circumstances where you've never witnessed my behavior. In fact, many of you, this is the first time you're ever interacting with me at all. And yet you can make all kinds of accurate predictions about how I would behave in situations that I've never even encountered because you know about my value. Right? So values are incredibly important cognitively in terms of what they enable us to predict about others in novel circumstances. And part of the reason we're able to do that is because we have a certain level of shared cognitive architecture, shared histories, shared developmental patterns, such that, as with standard theory of mind everywhere, I can, from limited samples, make a lot of projections about how you're going to behave in new circumstances and be relatively accurate about it. So the connection here is one of that values are playing a similar role to things like beliefs, where I make inferences from your beliefs or from your desires to all kinds of future behaviors of yours. And I can do that because we are in relevant ways similar to each other, right? So I can project in part on the basis of my own reasoning, on my own thinking. I don't have to have an infinite set of experiences with you. Now, why do I bring all this up? Okay, sorry. Now coming to the punchline of this. Generative AI systems don't generalize in the ways that we do. We know that these systems, when you give them finite samples, do not generalize in human standard ways. Sometimes that's good, because sometimes that means these systems discover things that surprise us. They do things that we didn't expect. And in some sense, that's part of what we want, right? I don't want an AI system that just replicates exactly what I previously told it. I want it to find new ideas, new approaches, new opportunities. The challenge, though, is that now I don't know actually which values have been taught to this generative AI system. I probably can't even linguistically express the values that are being taught to these generative AI systems because they think in different concepts than we have. And so I think that there's a kind of fundamental problem that we have with moral reasoning, which is that it can't be done without understanding values. It can't be done without having a shared set of values. But we don't know how to communicate values in ways that are not dependent upon or reliant upon certain aspects of shared cognitive architecture. Moral development requires that the teacher and the student have certain similarities in how they generalize and project out from the finite samples, the finite exemplars. And we don't have those guarantees with generative AI systems. Again, that's not necessarily a flaw, except if what you want to have is a system that can engage in the kinds of moral reasoning that we think is appropriate. So I actually think that there's a kind of fundamental barrier to doing moral reasoning with generative AI systems that is grounded in the fact that they don't share our cognitive architecture. Whether that means that we ought to just not even use these systems is, of course, a whole other question. But with that, make sure to leave a little bit of time for some questions.